All right, welcome back to the House Government Operations Military Affairs Committee for the second part of our morning here on January 19th. We are switching gears from ADS to get a little bit of teeing up of our jurisdiction and a little bit of context and history of the Cannabis Control Board from Legislative Council. So we have Michelle Childs with us, and I will turn it over to you. Thanks for being here this morning.
Sure. Good morning. So for the record, Michelle Childs with the Office of Legislative Counsel. And could I be so bold to ask if we could do a quick round? There's a lot of folks around this table that are new, who I don't know yet. So just so I can answer questions, would you mind if we did a quick spin around the room?
Very happy for us to do that, and I should be doing it more. So give me a nudge on intros every time.
Yeah, totally. Standardizing practices is an evolving process. Yeah.
Do you want to get started again?
Sure. Representative Matt Byron, Vice Chair of the committee. Live in Virgins and represent 5-6 communities in Northwest Madison County.
And if you want to say what committee, the jurisdiction you have done to, that might be a good thing to add.
Came from 2 terms in House General.
Representative Lucy Boyden. I live in Cambridge and represent District Memorial 3, which is Cambridge and Waterville. And this is my first term.
Representative Lisa Hango, Franklin 5, Highgate, Franklin, Berkshire, and Richford. I live in Berkshire, and I come also from House General and Military Affairs.
Michael Morgan, I represent Grand Isle County and western corner of Milton. I live in West Milton, and I claimed last year I was on corrections institutions.
I'm from Burlington, Gov.Ops.
Okay.
Chase Colchester, Energy and Technology.
I'm Shay Waters Evans. I live in and represent Charlotte and a little bit of Pittsburgh.
Jay Hooper, Brookfield, Braintree, Randolph, Granville, and Roxbury, 4th term.
Kate Nugent, 1st term, northeast corner of South Burlington, I would say, Chittenden.
Mark Kigley, Orleans, Memorial, Gov.Ops, 8 years, Energy and Technology, a couple, Ag and Forestry, back to Gov.Ops. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So for the new folks, I typically staff judiciary issues. I'm in my 25th year here at the legislature, and part of my portfolio has been regulated drugs. And so I've worked on the cannabis issue, since the 90s when everything was criminal. And so as things have evolved over the years, and we set up the medical program back in 2004, and then in 2020, the commercial system. I've just continued to work on that. So this is a little bit somewhat kind of, even though I'm for the General Assembly, the cannabis expert, I'm not usually doing kind of regulated products and things like that, but will continue to work on this issue. So I'll be your point person. Sometimes you may see, depending on the topic with regard to regulated cannabis, there are a couple other attorneys in the office who work on kind of discrete issues around things that kind of fall a little more into ag law, that the board is regulating with regard to cultivators, and then the complexities of the tax system and the fees and things like that we have on our money team to do. But generally, I can be your point person on all things related to drugs. So for a little bit of history, so I just mentioned that the first time that we really started seeing the cannabis laws change here in Vermont in recent memory, and they have changed over the course of like the last 100 years. They've gone back and forth depending on what's been going on kind of nationally in terms of, used to not be regulated at the turn of the century. And then it got kind of put into the category of a narcotic, and there were very high criminal penalties and mandatory minimums in the 50s and the 60s. You saw kind of a new approach with regard to cannabis. And you saw a lot of states looking to decriminalize. Vermont had some concerted efforts there in the 70s to decriminalize, passed the House, didn't get through the Senate. 80s penalties went way back up for drug crimes. And then in the 90s, you started to see states really strongly exploring the idea of a medical program where someone could get onto the registry and basically not get a prescription for cannabis, but be exempted from any of the penalties for possession of cannabis if you were on the registry. And Vermont, I think, was the 9th state to adopt a medical program in 2004. And there were various study committees and things like that here at the legislature kind of gearing up for that. So that was like, I think, like a 3-year effort coming through both bodies. And then they adopted the program in 2004. The General Assembly approved medical dispensaries in 2011, and then moved on to decriminalization of possession of an ounce or less, outside of the medical system in 2013. In 2018, I went from an ounce or less for personal possession, went from being decriminalized, meaning that you could receive a civil ticket, just like a speeding ticket or something like that, but not in criminal court. So that was what was in 2013. And then in 2018, the legislature moved to legalize possession of an ounce or less. So no penalties at all for as long as a person is 21 years of age or older and has it for personal possession. So that was 2018. And then in 2020, the General Assembly passed the commercial system and set up the Cannabis Control Board and the regulatory system for cannabis. And that was took about, I would say we worked on that for maybe 5 or 6 years on the various iterations. And then because it was standing up a new agency and there's a lot of kind of setup to get everything going. Bless the board for all the work they did, but they had a really tight schedule, rulemaking, all of that other kind of stuff. And so there's still, I think I'd have to go back and look at the timeline of when they kind of started coming on, but they're still really kind of getting set up to some extent, building the agency, getting the staff they need. There are usually multiple cannabis bills every year. The board will kind of come forward and put forth one and say, we need these tweaks to the law. We need to look at this. We need these positions for testing cannabis or things like that. And so there's always that, but there is a lot of cannabis legislation. And if you guys are going to be the ones that are going to continue, because cannabis, as it's moved from, it always used to be in judiciary, and then as it's moved into another realm, it's, been trying to find a home in both bodies. And I know this committee dealt with it when we were setting up the commercial system. So maybe now it's finally got a permanent home, it sounds like.
I believe that there are still some conversations, and the Senate has a different take on it for the current biennium about when you have a tax and regulated marketplace, should this really be commerce? I think, especially just given the different workloads and the experience of some of the folks who are on Gov.Ops, and this having been Gov.Ops previously, the speaker was inclined to keep it in House government operations, and that there are some, policy synergies around, some of the concerns and thinking with liquor and lottery, which is also now here. So different, but I think at a very high level there are some similar considerations about public safety and public health and all of that. So it is going to be here at least for this biennium.
Okay. All right. Great. So I thought what I'd do, if you would like to follow, if you have a device and you want to take a look at it, we did set up the commercial system in Title VII. So it's now alcoholic beverages, cannabis, and tobacco. Typically, cannabis has always been in Title 18 because the regulated drug chapter is in Title 18, which is your health title. And so it was in there listed with, and it still is with regard to the criminal penalties, listed in with cocaine and heroin and all of those things. When the medical program was set up, it was also in Title 18. And just for a little historical background, when that program was initially adopted, the regulatory agency that the General Assembly here designated to run the program was the Department of Public Safety. So we were actually the only state in the country that had their law enforcement agency running the medical cannabis program. Usually you would see them in the Department of Health, or you would see them in sometimes the tax department or like different places, but we had it in the Department of Public Safety, and they operated the registry and the program and licensing of the dispensaries until the new Cannabis Control Board was established and up and running. And then the medical program shifted over last year to the Cannabis Control Board. So now the Cannabis Control Board is going to manage, it manages both programs. So if you're in Title VII, you'll see starting in Chapter 31, if you're just going on and looking at the website in the statutes there, and you don't have to follow along, I just mention it if it's helpful. So there's a few different chapters, and it's divided up to kind of, there's a general chapter for cannabis, and that sets forth the criteria for the board. I know that you're hearing from James and Bryn this afternoon, which is great. And I think, questions about what they're doing now, those kinds of stuff, they can answer all of that stuff. I'm just trying to give you a little bit of a lay of the land. But the board, there's 3 members on the board. The board is an independent executive agency. So that was important, especially to this committee, the folks who were on this committee who set up the structure for the board is, cannabis can be a very political issue, and they wanted to kind of have an agency that was independent in terms of being able to operate. And so there are 3 board members there. There's also an executive director who is Bryn Hare, who used to be my partner on judiciary, and they have a general counsel, and then they can talk to you about all the positions that they have now. But they started out as a skeleton crew, basically the 3 board members and the executive director, and that's all they got to get going. And so now they're working on trying to build it out and get the staff they need. But James and I, before he was at the board, he used to, at one of his previous jobs, he was at the state's attorneys for a while, but he also used to work for Governor Shumlin. And so during the kind of 5-year period that the legislature was working very intensely on legislation, trying to set up the commercial system, James was our connection to the administration on that. So he's got a long history with this issue. So when he was appointed, he was always already very, very familiar with the regulatory system in other states. So they are a wonderful resource for you guys. And I love working with them. So he can talk to you a little bit about the board and who's on the board. There is, in terms of talking about the commercial system, it's a licensing system where folks can apply for any of a number of licenses to operate a cannabis establishment. There are cultivator licenses that are divided up into various tiers depending on size. There is a real focus in the legislation and also on the part of the board on trying to support and highlight small cultivators in Vermont, and to try to have most, if not all, of the market be supplied by small cultivators rather than large operations. There are also wholesaler licenses, and so that would be somebody just like, when you see the Black River produce truck driving around, with taking vegetables from here to there. So that's the type, somebody can apply for that license. With regard to cannabis, there are also product manufacturer licenses. And so that is if someone wants to take flower and then turn that into a salve or an edible or a tincture or something like that, they would get a product manufacturer license. There are retail licenses, which is just what you would imagine. So selling directly to the public. Retailers are the only ones that are allowed to sell directly to the public. So you can't, there's no ability for cultivators to do direct sales or product manufacturers to do direct sales or such. There are also testing laboratory licenses. So there's a very comprehensive system, like through the rules and everything, for testing all of products before they're provided for sale to the public. And so folks can apply for a testing license. And then there's a unique license category called integrated licenses. And those are only available to the medical dispensaries that were licensed at the time when the commercial system came up. Medical dispensaries are different in that they are allowed to be vertically integrated under one license, meaning they could get their license and they could do everything from seed to sale. So, and under one license. The way that the commercial system is set up, you just get one license. You can have one of each type of license if you'd like, but you cannot have multiple of any particular license. And so the idea is that, again, the General Assembly was very concerned about, they didn't want to have kind of, corporate weed, is basically how everybody refers to it, but they didn't want these big stores or these big companies to come in and kind of be the McDonald's of cannabis and have multiple places. They wanted to make sure that Vermonters would have an opportunity to enter the market. And so you're only allowed, like if you have a retail license, you only have one.
So are you okay taking clarifying questions?
Yeah, clarifying, please. I was under the impression that if you had, for instance, a retail license, you could not hold any of the other licenses in the tier system. Like you could not be a cultivator and a retailer. Is that not correct? Okay, so you just said that was good for me to hear.
Yeah, you can't hold more than one of a particular type because they don't want people kind of cornering the market. But, and I think, probably Brendan and Pepper can talk a little more about what they're seeing people apply for. And the idea in setting it up was to allow people to mix and match in the sense of, maybe, somebody would want to have, like if you had a little micro business and you were a product manufacturer and you wanted to be able to, and I don't know at what stage they are in kind of rolling that piece out. So I'll just tell you how it was initially set up with the statutes is that people could have different licenses, because if you wanted to be able to have your little product manufacturing, but then you did want to do sales, and you would get like a small retailer license or things like that. And so there is the ability to mix and match there, but you can't be kind of like the only show in town.
Okay, maybe this might be a little too nuanced for right now, but so could you be like a primary, like a majority partner or shareholder in like one of the entities and a minority in the other? Like, isn't there like a break? Like you can't be the controlling?
Yes, there are. And that's an excellent question. And I'm going to kick it to the board a little bit just because it's been so long since I've kind of digged into that. But we did spend a lot of time in looking at it so that basically you couldn't kind of have these silent partners that were actually kind of gaming the system and running a bunch of different ones. So there is stuff. Exactly. And so I think probably Bren is probably the one to kind of can talk to you about what they do, because for anybody that is going to be applying for a license, there's a lot they have to do in terms of the application. Everybody has to have a criminal background check. They have to do financial disclosures. And so the idea is that everything is very above board. Who are the people behind the company and the applicants and all of that kind of stuff, to try to make sure that somebody with a really creative lawyer isn't being like, okay, here's how you can actually own 5 stores.
Cool. I'll follow up with them. Thank you.
Okay, keep going?
Yeah, please.
Sure. So the licenses, there's no restrictions on how many stores or cultivators or things like that are. That's something that the legislature kind of bounced around. Should we say, oh, there can only be 20 retailers in the state or this or that. And so there was a big discussion in here about that. And they're like, well, it's not like we'd say there can only be 5 liquor stores or, those types of things. And so the board can, again, they try to strive for geographic distribution so that you don't have, everybody kind of in one little town. But something that affects that is, so those of you who have been around here for a little while know that basically in order to have a retail shop in your town, the town has to vote to approve to allow those types of stores. And so there are many towns that have done that, and kind of, I don't know, if there's anything coming up on the March ballots this year for some towns. It was kind of like right when the legislation passed, the towns that were interested kind of were like, yeah, let's get in there. And, if you've walked downtown Montpelier, there's one directly across the street from City Hall. So they're, and again, I think probably Brendan Pepper can talk to you about, the distribution and where the shops are and things like that. But they still are in some ways, really at the beginning of rolling out all these places. And then it's going to be up to the market to decide, however many are in Burlington now. I know that was one of the concerns, is it's going to be the market that's going to decide whether or not, can it handle 8 shops, or can it only, is it only got enough customers for 4 shops or something like that. But there is not a cap. As opposed to the integrated licensees, there's only that cap on that dispensaries from earlier. It used to be like when the legislature rolled out the dispensaries, they were like, we're only going to allow a handful of these, and they didn't open it up to have as many as they want. But that's not the way that it is with the commercial system. The medical program is still operating, and there's strong interest on the part of the board to keep that going. I think there's definitely been concern in this body over the years about what would happen to the medical program once there was a commercial system. And in the legislation in 2020, there were some findings that the General Assembly put in there about recognizing what they saw as the value of continuing to have a medical program, because people who might be going into an adult use shop looking for certain items, could be very different from someone who is trying to access some expertise in cannabis in order to treat a medical condition or symptoms, and they wanted to try to preserve that. So there are some things that are different between the medical system and the adult use. So as I mentioned, you have to be 21 years or older to be able to even walk into a cannabis establishment, one of the commercial ones. On the medical program, you can be under 21, and there are minors that are on there. And the way that the medical system works is your healthcare provider fills out a medical verification form. There are certain conditions that are set forth in statute that if you have one of these conditions, then that would qualify you to be on the medical registry. And so your provider fills out a form and says, I treat this patient, I have a healthcare practitioner patient relationship with this person, they have cancer, or they have chronic pain, or they have these things, and then they fill that out. That goes to the person, that gets submitted to the Cannabis Control Board with the person's application, and then they get a registry card, and that allows them to go to a licensed medical dispensary, which may be separate and apart from any commercial operation that they operate. There are things that you can that are advantages with staying with the medical program if that's your route. So medical cannabis is not taxed. So if you are going through the commercial system, there's a 20% tax on cannabis and cannabis flower. Those taxes do not apply if you are purchasing from a dispensary. Dispensaries are also allowed to do delivery to patients. And so a lot of patients that are on the registry, and they could probably talk to you about the demographics, but they have typically tended to be older. And a lot of people have mobility issues, things like that. So I know the one down in Brattleboro, and I don't know if it's this way, it had a drive-through so that people didn't have.
It was a bank.
Oh, right. And so you could do that. They would come out to your car, things like that. So there's a certain accommodations trying to meet the needs of the community that is utilizing the dispensaries. Also at the dispensaries, patients can get higher THC dosages. So there's caps for the commercial system that do not exist within the medical system. And so there's a greater variety of products there for patients. There also, if you are on the registry, you are allowed to possess more cannabis than if you are under the adult use. And that applies to whether or not you're talking about usable cannabis or you're talking about plants and growing plants, although it's negligible. Under the adult use law, someone can possess an ounce or less, like on their person, and they can have up to 2 mature plants and 4 immature plants. And then they can have any flower that they harvest from those plants, as long as it's kept with, like, on the property with the plants. And then on the medical side, they can have 2 mature and 7 immature. So it's not that different, but medical patients are allowed to have 2 ounces. So if you go to a commercial store and it's just, if I'm not on the registry, I can buy up to an ounce of product, like any combination. So it could be 1/4 ounce of flour, it could be an edible, it could be a vape, whatever, and they have a formula for how they figure out how that works out to an ounce. But if I went to a dispensary because I was on the registry, I could be able to purchase up to 2 ounces. And the idea is just that patients who are using regularly, may need more, and they don't want them to have to constantly be coming back into the store. Any questions about any of that?
We will hear from Chair Pepper about some of the ways that the medical versus the retail markets are evolving this afternoon.
Yeah.
And the interplay between those things will be a subject that they may ask us to weigh in on. So Representative Chase and then Representative Byron.
You've mentioned flower a few times. Does that refer to any of the plant matter or just specific parts of it? What's the definition of that?
Of flower. Flower is I'm not the cannabis artist. Flower is like the bud that people use. It's not like the stalks or the seed or any of that stuff. So if I say flower, I just mean usable cannabis.
And is there a legal distinction between, like a definition distinction between cannabis, hemp, marijuana?
Yes.
I think there's a THC.
Yes.
percentage.
Yep. We're not talking about hemp here at all. That's an agricultural product. It's not, although the board does have some authority to regulate some products that are derived from hemp around, like, because there might be CBD that's taken from hemp and then I think combined with cannabis, but that's a little beyond my grade there about knowing that. But no, these are totally it's the same plant, but the THC content and where that falls is what distinguishes whether or not it's considered under the law. And I'm talking like federal law, which then we mirror, whether it's considered to be hemp or whether it's considered to be cannabis.
Marijuana includes both of them, or?
So I want to be, and maybe Michelle, you could help us with this. So I want to be really careful in here because of the history of the word, that we use the word cannabis when we are describing this. And I believe, to clarify this, that marijuana is
a term that has a whole history, a racial connotation that I don't even know all of the details of. But Michelle, I don't know if you can help us, or maybe if we should talk to Bryn about that specific piece. But I think when people refer to in terms of policy making, we're talking about the same thing. We're talking about the psychoactive.
So one's like slang.
Yeah, marijuana is essentially slang. It
has like Spanish Mexican origins and was used in a derogatory fashion during its original decriminalization after Prohibition.
Yeah, it's got a fraught history, and so very good question. I'm glad that you asked it, but just to kind of set for us here when we're talking about the drug from the plant, when we're talking about cannabinoids, that we're using cannabis to describe that when we're here in the room. And, I think, Michelle, when we're talking about the sort of retail market and we're talking about, pot, weed, other slang terms that are used, I think that we're going to, obviously, I'm not going to be a policeman about the exact language that we use in here. I want us to be able to have conversations and use the language that our constituents are used to hearing. But when we're really digging in on policy, like it's cannabis in the law.
That was one of the things that we did do in the 2020 legislation was, sometimes you'll see a little directive to our office. We do statutory revision and we work on the law books and updating all the law books and stuff during the summer. And part of that 2020 legislation was directing me essentially to go and change the word throughout all of the titles so that marijuana does not appear in Vermont law, that term, any longer. It is cannabis. And I had done a number of presentations over the years on history of cannabis regulation in Vermont and things like that. And I just so happen to have a couple little slides here from kind of what you're talking about, and I'll just pass them around about the cultural factors with regard to the use of the term marijuana. And there was definitely, with the establishment after Prohibition in the United States, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was established and there was a real push to include cannabis in with narcotics and to associate cannabis with people of color and with disfavored populations, and so marijuana is considered to be kind of part of that era. And you still see it in many states. It's still, that term is used, whatever, but the trend is certainly to be using the term cannabis, which is the name of the plant, rather than to be using the colloquial term.
Another area that I don't know if you're planning on touching on, or if we might want to get some folks, either Chair Pepper or others to talk about, is we really have looked at pretty much just regulating THC, that one chemical that's in cannabis, as the psychoactive. When we're looking at the percent content and all that, the law, as I understand it, really focuses on that. Chair Pepper already talked to us last week a little bit about how there are other psychoactive cannabinoids that have been able to be extracted from the plant and concentrated and then sold that aren't regulated. Do you want to talk about that at all, or could you maybe?
I don't know as much about that. That's kind of, it's fast evolving. I, probably can learn a lot about that from both Bryn and Pepper. But I know that the board is very aware of that, and and then comes to the legislature when they need some additional authority with regard to regulating certain products around that. So I believe that, if my memory serves me, last year, I think you gave them authority to regulate Delta 8 and things like that. But I will just say, I don't honestly just know the difference between all that stuff. is
Your legislative counsel, you're not a biochemist.
not. And I know there's things called terpenes, this and that stuff, and I just, I leave it to them. Tell me what they need.
Michelle, Chair Pepper talked a little bit about this, but again, it appears that there's not too many banking institutions that take this on. Can you talk about maybe a little bit the ones that are and what would have to change federally for other institutions?
I don't know what the state is currently about that. I mean, I know that, because cannabis continues to be a Schedule I drug, that is a barrier in terms of banking for cannabis establishments. And that has always been the case. I know that when we just had the dispensaries, that was an issue for them. And they were lucky to be able to use the credit union that was willing to work with them. But that is a tricky issue. There's been legislation at the federal level around trying to ease restrictions and make it easier so that banks will lend to these types of businesses. I am not familiar about where that is right now, but it really is because of the federal designation. So when the Controlled Substances Act was adopted in, I think, 1970, that established the tiered schedule system, and it put certain drugs in the various tiers. And there was the history around it is really interesting. And there was a big fight about, well, where should cannabis be placed in the tiers? There was not unanimity. It wound up being placed at the time. They considered it was supposed to be temporarily placed in Schedule I. Schedule I being drugs that cannot be possessed or used or sold, not even for medical testing, or that it has no uses at all. So it's the absolute most restrictive. But then they set up something called the Schaefer Commission, which was a commission of folks who looked at the issue to decide about, well, where should cannabis really fall on the schedules? And they came back and they recommended that it not be a criminal offense, but Nixon did not agree with that. And so it has stayed there, and it's still there. But with so many states, and I don't know what the number is now in terms of, most states have a medical program. And I think we're up to almost half the states, or probably around 18, 20 or something like that, that now have authorized adult use sales. And so, I mean, I got to believe that at some point with so many states, because, it's this odd thing where you have it's illegal at the federal level, and states aren't required to have the same exact law as the feds. We have concurrent jurisdiction on issues around drugs, but obviously there's a tension there, and that was something when you guys were starting to bring on even just the medical program, it's always kind of like people have to be aware of the risk that they are taking. It's still a violation of federal law. And there's just this kind of truce around the federal government saying, if you have a well-regulated market where you're trying to look at, there were these memos under the Obama administration that kind of said, we want to make sure nobody's selling to kids. We want to make sure it's not crossing state borders. We want to make sure, like certain things, then you're not going to be a law enforcement priority for us. It doesn't mean that it's not still in violation of federal law, but we've got other things to do. And so that was one of the things in setting up the program, was to say, how can the state regulate it in a way that we can feel fairly confident that the feds won't step in?
You know what the penalties are?
For what?
Violating the Banking Act. Like the credit union used to do it, and then they merged with a federal credit union. And just kind of wondered what their exposure was. Yours, from federal regulators.
You mean like what the banks are facing for doing business, I don't know.
Representative Higley?
Just one other clarifying question for me, and I'm under the assumption that even though we have a tax and regulate market now, that the previous law is still in effect where you can have an ounce have two mature plants, 4 immature plants, all that is still legal, okay, yep.
My question's on the medical side. So did we ever update from the original list of qualifying ailments, medical conditions to like expand it at all? Because I knew there were a lot of restrictions around like anxiety. There were vast limitations to what chronic pain was defined as. We actually had some of the highest, it was like the highest entry bar from what I know in the country. So did we ever look at opening that bar more broadly?
There have been, it has over the years, just like little changes, like a few years ago. And Mike, you probably remember, I think you were on Human Services at the time, and you could talk about that was the, is the PTSD was added, but only if you only if you're in therapy and all these other kind of stuff. It is I don't know where it falls now that so many states have it, but it has typically been one of the most restrictive in terms of being able to get on the registry. There have been bills, as long as we've had a registry, to expand the list of qualifying medical conditions. But that was a tough sell in the committee that previously dealt with the medical program. That was, so that hasn't changed much, but there's a bill every year, and I'm pretty sure I just wrote the CCB's one, and I think coming from the CCB, they're asking to expand it, and so
no, you just answered my question. I thought that's what you were going to say. I just wanted to affirm Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the question is now, because if you have someone, let's say, anybody 21 or older can walk into the Capitol Cannabis and buy, right? And so, from a policy perspective, what is the value of restrictions around the qualifying conditions if your medical provider says you have a certain thing, whatever. And so now that I'm remembering is that the Cannabis Control Board had made some suggestions that I included in the draft, that for expanding certain, adding, I think, Alzheimer's, there's a number of conditions on there that they have, that they are suggesting to expand.
I have a feeling we're going to hear a lot more about that from Chair Pepper. Representative Hancock.
Just a comment that is the Pandora's box of having recreational cannabis products available to people, because they can circumvent the medical system and self-medicate.
I think what you may hear from Chair Pepper is that the other side of that is that if you take folks out of the medical market that can find the products that they need in the retail market, that it creates a sort of some of the things that only the medical market can do, they don't have enough customer base to support it. So I think that's the other side of that we're going to hear this afternoon.
Right, and the products can, and Pepper can talk about that, is that, what somebody might take for a medical condition, maybe low THC, high in CBDs and other certain things, and it's a certain balance and things like that. Whereas maybe on the commercial market, people might be looking for a higher THC product and things like that. And so somebody who is truly looking to access cannabis for alleviation of nausea or pain or things like that may not be able to find those products in a commercial system if there is no medical system that is trying to focus on those types of products.
Michelle, you've been very generous in answering lots of questions that are all over the map. And I wanted to have that time. Did you have other things you wanted to present to us?
No, I mean, I just thought we'd just have a conversation about.
I love it. I just wanted to make sure we were covering everything that you thought we should have as just a real basic.
Sure. I mean, I will say, and I think that probably the board, Pepper and Brent can talk about it when they're here this afternoon, is about there are components around social equity applicants and things like that that are built into the program. So it was important to the General Assembly that there be elements in there so that people who had been disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition would not be excluded from entering the legal market. So for instance, if someone has a cannabis sale conviction, they didn't want that to be like, okay, well now it's legal, but because you did it 10 years ago, we're not going to then bar you from doing it now. And so they can talk to you a little bit about that. There's also, you set up a social equity program around getting business loans, and there's a revolving loan fund, and I'm not sure at what stage the kind of rollout is for that stuff, but they can talk to you about that.
I think you've touched on a number of what I think we're going to hear in the introduction from the Cannabis Control Board folks this afternoon about some of the key, the legislative principles that were undergirding all of the move into having a tax and regulated recreational market and also having a parallel medical system. Social equity. Also, what you were just touching on, Michelle, was about this idea that we're trying to bring folks who are in the illicit market into.
Right. And that was up front, like in the very front part of the bill is the whole purpose was, and this goes throughout all of it, because you have to think about in terms of if you put on so much regulation and you make it expensive for people to enter the market, then they're going to stay in the illicit market. And so it's always this balancing that you're doing to look at the policy and say, what do we need to do to have a safe product out there? Because it is out there. Back in, I think, 2015, the legislature had, or maybe it was someone, I can't remember, but they had the Rand Corporation do this big study, and it's an interesting, you can find it online if you just Google, and they determined that there were 80,000 regular cannabis users in Vermont. And then they, and they looked at kind of the market and who uses it. And so the idea was to say, how can we move that? It exists. It's here. How do we move it into a regulated system to try to have a safe product, to keep it out of the hands of under 21, things like that. And so that's always kind of the guiding principle behind all this, is to try to move as much of the illegal market into the regulated market from a consumer safety standpoint.
Yeah, I think a lot of the conversations we'll have will be about that first principle, and then consumer safety. The idea of we're trying to make sure that the products that are being sold there's a tension between, and I think we're going to hear from a lot of folks as we look at, concentrations and what types of products that are allowed to be sold. There's a tension between some of the consumer safety, public health advocates, and the desire that we have to bring the products into a fully regulated market.
Right, because and that's the thing, is that there are so many illicit products, and it's not just flour, it's the vapes, it's the everything. And if you have teenagers, you already know this because you can get anything on the internet or in high school. And so again, I think it's the goal was to try to say, if we can make it, I talked to my teenagers, and, it's a lot hard. According to them, it's way harder to get alcohol than it is to get cannabis. And they attribute that to it being regulated. And so.
Representative Nugent.
Speaking of like the historic, you were talking about like the products being safer. I'm just wondering, is there any data, and this might not be the right question for you necessarily, but about the safety of products like throughout Vermont's history? I don't know, maybe since like the 70s, like what are we aware of people's safety issues around that using illicit marijuana?
I mean, just from a health perspective in general about the studies, things like that?
Just curious, like what types of things may have come up during that period? Because you're saying like part of the effort is to make the products safer. So what is that? What does that look like, I guess?
Well, part of the problem with cannabis being a Schedule I drug, I will just say, is that people haven't been able to study it because it's just on the no-go. It has been on the no-go list. And so in terms of scientific data around impact of cannabis on people's health and things like that, we're really kind of way behind, and there's a lot that we don't know. In terms of the safety issue, probably the board could address it better than I can, but I know that one of the things that was frequently discussed is, cannabis, like alcohol, can have, based on its THC content, can have a very different effect. So, you might hear people during the debates and stuff, people would, say, this is not the cannabis that I grew up with, in the 70s, or this, it's very different and whatever. And there is definitely more with people growing, and there, a lot of people are trying to develop strains with a very high THC content. And so, it's the same, like, beer is not the same as having, a glass of Jack, right? And there can be a big difference in terms of that with regard to even flower. So you could have something that's a lower THC content or a much higher THC content, and you don't necessarily, on an illegal market, you don't really know what it is that you're getting. When it comes down to products, I think it was very scary for a lot of folks around the vaping products. You remember, like, a few years ago, there were a lot of, I can't remember what they figured. It was like there was something that the vapes, the illegal vapes, were being cut with.
I believe it was vitamin E.
Vitamin E. And people were dying from that. And again, these products they're everywhere, and they're not tested. You don't know what's in them. There's the same thing with like nicotine vapes, again, kind of, I know I'm just talking a lot about my teenagers, but I learn a lot from my teenagers. And, these products, not busting on China, but, like manufactured in places with different standards, and you don't know what's in them. And so they exist. And so the folks that were looking at setting up the regulatory system were like, that's out there. So if we can cut into that and reduce the prevalence of that by having products that have gone through the regulatory process, and we're saying you cannot use these types of additives in your products. You must have these products tested. They can't have more than this or that. Then, the hope is that you would have a safer product for folks on that end. And a lot of the stuff that is out there, and these concentrates, things like that, like, it's just, if you're buying on the illegal market, there's no guarantee that you know what it is. If you are buying from the shop downtown, there's labeling requirements and things like that. So, and you have to be given some information about some of the safety tips and the impacts, the health impacts, the safety impacts of that. So I think what they're trying to do is just approach it and say, from kind of the regulatory model being more of a harm reduction approach.
And I think Representative Nugent, that James Pepper and Bryn can bring a lot more about the sort of history, the evolution of products, many of the things that Michelle touched on. So I would say ask that question again when we have our guests in this afternoon. Any other questions for Michelle about our kind of jurisdiction? We're really going to be looking at most of this, I think, in the context of we have this new marketplace, cannabis control boards, finally got all of the licenses that were authorized are now out there in the market with new businesses being stood up. And we're going to be hearing a lot more about that this afternoon. But any last questions for Michelle about our jurisdiction and what we're covering in that area? All right. Well, thank you very much, Michelle.
Thanks for having me in.
First big overview on our jurisdiction. We'll be talking about this more this afternoon. We are done for this morning, and we'll see everybody back here after lunch at 1 o'clock.